Hey everybody. So as we're getting ready to start our next project, I wanted to talk about um, file structure and organization and some of the decisions and thought processes that need to be in your head as you make these decisions. Right? Nobody's life is the same, so everybody has a different arrangement, and so these are going to affect each of you differently. But you need to start thinking long term about where you want to house and maintain all of your files throughout the project. Okay? It's a multi-week project, which means there's going to be times when you're needing to maybe use them in a different location, right? Do you want to store those on a thumb drive? Do you want to store those on a potentially on OneDrive, or do you need to use AppStream? All of these things will affect how you're storing your files, and so this should be something that you plan. Okay, so let's hop really quick into PowerPoint, and I'm going to walk you through some things to think about. So um, we all kind of understand how Maya works in terms of the project structure, but let's hammer on this again. The way you use Maya, the way you should be using Maya, is opening up Maya, an empty scene, by going to your start menu and typing in Maya. Right? You open up a completely empty scene, and then you set your project to the folder that has all of your files, whether that's on your thumb drive, whether that's in your OneDrive folder, whether that's in a network folder. Um, you will set your project, and then you can open your file. Now, although you've probably all been bitten by a version of this, let's talk about why that is. It's because this is a sort of an example folder structure we may see in a Maya project, right? Um, and we all recognize, we have our hard drive, our C drive, and maybe there's the My Documents folder, and maybe you keep a bunch of stuff in your My Documents folder that's all Maya related in this Maya stuff folder. But this project is just the My Project part. The stuff that Maya actually cares about is is just that stuff right there, all of the stuff in blue. Right? All of the other elements are just technical uh, directions to where your Maya project is stored, right? It can be on any hard drive, but you could take all of this My Project folder and below, and you can move that anywhere, and your Maya file and Maya, all of your connections should still stay intact, right? You um, need um, to be able to make sure that Maya knows how to find the path to all of these things. So I like to personally organize this a little more than what we already have, the default folder structure that already comes with this, which includes a lot more than you're actually seeing in this list, but this is just an example of some. Your images is where you're going to store your renders or maybe some reference images. Your movies folder is where Maya stores your play blasts. Your scenes folder is where Maya is storing your Maya files, and your source images is usually where we keep reference images and texture images, and anything that's going to be plugged in as a source to one of your Maya files, right? So I like to drill down a little deeper than this. I usually will also, when it comes to like my scenes folder, I will break that out and add some additional folders underneath there, right? So I can keep like my rigs in a folder, or my animations in a folder, or environments or models in a folder, right? Now, um, you're probably pretty aware of one of the reasons we like to set our project is because when we are dealing with textures, right, we get like, this texture one file. Maybe that is a texture that is being applied into our environment one model, right? And so the only way Maya knows how to keep that connection to make sure that texture one source images is plugged into the environment one uh, model is to make sure that Maya can always find the location of texture one. And to do that, it has to stay within the relative path of this My Project folder, right? So, when you're applying that texture, if you open up a file, you will see, this is the path to that texture, right? In your materials is whatever is listed in here. Um, and you're going to see two different options of things that show up in that. You're either going to see one of these two types of paths, right? You'll notice the first starts with C: users, Marlowe G classes. Um, the issue with that is if I give you this project, or if you move from one computer to the other, this top path may not be the same anymore, right? If you've set your project, though, Maya just needs to know, relative to the project folder, where is that texture, right? And you'll see in the lower one, source images, it just has to tell it that within the project folder, it's in the source images folder, and we're looking for this tree.png, right? Um, Setting your project is going to ensure that you always get this bottom type of path, right? Because that top path can break. Right? We can move the folder, and if any of this stuff changes, if the Marlowe G changes, if the classes change, if the 3D, any of this, then this path is no longer true, and Maya can no longer find your texture. And that's why your textures break when you open up a project. Now, it's not always your fault. Sometimes maybe you downloaded a rig to use for free, and and that person didn't set their project when they were applying the textures, and you open up the file and you can't find it, right? Or Maya can't find the right texture. So now you know how to fix it. Is you just go back to how we saw earlier in this section, and you make sure that this path is correct, right? The texture file that it is looking for is correct, and I'll show you a way inside of Maya to adjust those paths in the future here. So the reason I'm kind of harping on this, and I know that you all are very aware of this, and many of you have probably even been bitten by this before, right? That you didn't set your project correctly, and now when you opened your file, all of your textures broke, and it just took you forever to wire all of that stuff back up, right? So the reason for thinking about this is because I'm going to have you structure your projects using a file management tool called referencing. Now, this can get confusing with the naming because referencing makes it sound like you went and shot reference, or you are referring to some source images or something like that. Referencing is about referencing other Maya files in order to build your scene. So let's think of it in terms of shots, right? Let's say we have let's say we have 4 shots of animation. Maybe one is like a long shot where we're seeing the action from far away, and the next one's a close up, and then the next one's an over the shoulder shot, and then the third one or the fourth one is maybe we're pulling away, right? But they all happen in the same environment, right? In the traditional way that most people would work, you would create your environment, you would bring your character, your objects that are going to be animated into that environment, and then you would start doing your animation for shot 1, and you would save that as a Maya file, right? And then maybe you would start doing the animation for shot 2, and you'd save that as a different Maya file. Well, let's say that in the process of doing that, you realized after you'd already animated all 4 of these shots that the environment needed to change, or the character needed to change, something needed to change. Well, as it is right now, to fix the environment in all 4 of those shots, you have to fix it in all 4 shots, right? You have to open it up, and if you have to change a texture on something, if you have to add a model to something, you have to do that 4 times, right? And maybe you do it 4 times, and then after you've done that, you realize it's still not right, and you have to go do it 4 more times, right? Well, referencing works different. Instead, what we do with referencing is we have different Maya files, right, for our shots, and those shots just contain the animation. And the environment lives in another Maya file outside of these shots, and we've just kind of plugged them in the same way that well, not in the same way, but in a very similar way to how you plug in your textures to um, a model, right? You know that you can go back and make changes to that texture, and it will update on your model. Well, this would work the same way. If my environment had some issues with it that I needed to change, all I would have to do is change this model, and it would automatically update in all of my 4 Maya animation shots. Right? So let's hop out really quick and I don't know why I had that slide. Let's hop out really quick and just look at Maya and see what see if we can see this in action. So first, I've just opened up a completely blank new Maya file, right? And I'm going to go to File and Set Project, and I'm going to set my project to my example folder here that's currently in my temporary folder, right? Set. So that means if I were to open one of my files, I could go File, Open Scene, and you'll see that I already have this kind of broken up here. I have an anims folder and models, right? And I can open these and show you, but we just have an environment and a ball, right? They're very simple. But this isn't how I'm actually going to open this. Right? What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to create a new file, or save a new file that actually has nothing in it. Right? We see what we have in our scene here is absolutely nothing, just the default empty Maya scene. I'm going to go File, Save Scene As, and I want to save this in my anims folder as, let's say, ball bounce 1. Let's do the .0001.mb, right? Just so we know this is the first of these animation shots. So there's no ball in here, there's no environment here, and there's no animation in here. There's nothing. I just saved an empty file. Right? And in fact, if we wanted to go back and look at that, let me see if I can find that really quickly. You'll see this within the folder structure of my scenes. I have this anim file, and it's very small. There's almost nothing in it. Right? Well, in our models folder, we have a ball and an environment, and they got a little bit of something in them. They're a little bit bigger, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reference those 2 objects in. I'm going to go File and Create Reference. Okay. Now we can do it with Create Reference, or we could also do it with a reference editor. Let's do it both ways just so you see how it works. So with Create Reference, it looks just like I'm opening a file. Okay, it goes to the same setup. I'm going to go to Models, and I can choose my ball or my environment. Let's maybe start with the ball. Now before I hit Reference, I want to make sure that this is correct here. So use namespace. If I leave it checked as it is, it's going to use ball at the beginning of everything. Right? When I import it in, my ball model will be ball.ball. And I don't want that. I don't want it to rename anything. So what I'm going to do is merge into selected namespace and rename objects that match. Okay? So that means the only reason it would change any names is if the original name already existed in that scene. So I'll hit Reference, and you'll see it looks just like I imported in the ball or just opened the ball. Right? There's a couple of things you'll want to recognize here, though. My object in here, my pSphere 1, right, that's not actually in this scene. Right? That is still in the ball scene. Right? And you can tell that just by seeing this little blue star on here. Right? So this is a referenced object, meaning I can't change anything in here that that is saved in the referenced object, right? So if I were to try to rename this to ball, it won't let me, right? If I want to rename that to ball, I have to open up my ball scene and rename it there. Right? But you don't want to do a lot of renaming once you've started this process. So make sure you name everything pretty cleanly. What I can do, though, is I can add new things to it, right? I could move it to a different location, right? Let's say move it over to there. Right? And what I've changed are things that are not necessarily permanent, right? Especially if I hit S, right? Because there were no keyframes on the original ball. And if I hit S, I've nailed down this object in space, right? And the only thing, if I just go to File, Save Scene, The only thing that is actually being saved in this scene is the reference to this ball, right? When I created that reference, the path to that ball, and one keyframe. That is the only thing that is actually in the file I just saved. Right? You'll notice that because the ball's 54 kilobytes and my original scene was like 55, and it didn't double in size, right? It's just a little bit bigger. The only thing that is saved in here is one keyframe, which apparently is taking up 2 kilobytes. Right? So let's reference in some more stuff. I'll go File, and we'll go to our reference editor. And so the reference editor, you will see there's our ball. Right? That's the reference that we had brought in. You'll notice that I can uncheck this. The ball disappears. It's no longer in the scene. And I can bring it back, and the ball's there again. So let's go File, Create Reference from here, and I'll bring in my environment. And again, I want to make sure this is set correctly, but it probably should be to where I have this bottom one checked. Merge into selected namespace. And I hit Reference. And so now I have two things that are in my scene, my environment and my ball. Right? And if I hit Save, again, neither of these meshes are being saved with that file. Only a link to those other Maya files and any keyframes or things that I add in this file. If I created a new object in this file, that would be saved with it. So let's do a very quick animation here, just so we can have something that we have saved. I want to make sure auto key is on. I'm just going to do a little bouncing ball very quickly. It won't even really break any tangents too much. So we just get that, right? And then maybe I'll copy paste that a few times. Copy, paste. Oh, play blasted it. By accident, and then paste, right? So now I just have this ball animating. So let's say I was doing all this animation, and I'm going to go ahead and save that. I'll even increment and save so we get a second animation file, right? So that is one of the benefits, is I can do this increment and save, and since my file isn't also containing all of the models, these files are really small, right? So when it comes time, let's say I've been animating and I'm like, you know what? I don't actually like this environment. Maybe I want like a little statue on the top of each of these little pedestals, right? Well, what I can do is I save my model, or I save my animation. I can just reopen my original scene, right? My original model, this environment, right? And hit open. And I could quickly go in here and maybe just, plop these in here quickly. I don't want it to be too much time. It's not going to be very pretty. Right, so now we have all those models with these little orbs floating above it, right? And I'll just save my scene again, and I'm just going to save over top of that original environment. Right? Now, if I go back and open up my animation scene again, where I've done my bouncing ball, you'll see that those objects are in there now, right? I just updated my environment, and that will update to any changes I make. So there's a really cool element to this. This means you can usually start animating before your environment is done and still be working on your environment or your models at the same time. Something else that's really cool about this. Let's go ahead and create a completely new scene. Let's say that I didn't like that environment. Or let's say I wanted this ball to be bouncing in multiple environments, right? Let's grab some vertices here and hit B to soften my brush here, make that a little bit bigger, move that up a little bit. Let's soften that even more. And I'm going to save this as file, save scene as. I'm going to put this in my models, and I'll call this environment alternate. Okay. Save as. Now, if I go back to my my animation, right, it's still looking at our old environment, but I could replace that. I can go back to my reference editor, right, and I can say, this environment, like this is the path to it right now. Ooh, unresolved name. Why would you do that? So I don't necessarily know why it's loading the full name like this. I think the fact that we get this double line here means that it's fine without it. Let's double check. If I backspace out of that, what do we get? Okay. So let's try that again here. Let's just open this scene again. I think that this may be, because I set my project, so it's all right. Open, don't save. I believe that this is still looking at the right location. It's just telling me in the reference editor that the environment currently lives here at this scenes. But I think that because we get this double line here on examples, I think that means that it's looking at the local. I think this is just a different way of showing it in our reference editor than usual. So I think this will still work if you move the file somewhere else. If not, we can always point to the new location of it. If the object is lost, I can say reload reference or replace reference files. Right. So let's replace the current reference of this environment. So reference, replace reference, and I'm just going to replace it with this environment alt. And so now we still have our same animation, right? It's just now with this alternate environment, right? Now there's a couple things you have to be careful with, right? Like obviously I can't make changes in here very easily, or I can, right? But recognize that if I'm making those changes to the model, what's happening is I'm reorganizing these vertices, right, locally. So it's basically on top of what the modeling was in the other file. It's not updating it in my reference file, right? If I increment and save here, and then I go back and open my environment alt, you'll see that that change doesn't happen in here, right? Well, it's still bringing this file in, and then the addition that I added was to this file, right? So it has some keyframes and it has some altered mesh, right? So if I want this change to be permanent, I can't do it in this file. This is cool though. This means that we can make some subtle changes if we need to in the scene. And we can do stuff like add layers or add keyframes. We can change textures, but what we can't do is repath a texture permanently, right? Because that information is going to come in with the reference, right? So if you need to change a texture path or something, you would have to go back to your reference file to do that. So finally, let's say that we've been referencing and it's working great, but for some reason I need to bring this file permanently into Maya. I can select this and go to File, Import Objects from Reference, and now you'll see that this plane no longer has that little blue square on it saying it's being referenced. Now this permanently lives inside of this file. Now the reference file still exists too. We just now have a version of that model saved inside of here. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. But this is very beneficial because we can swap out environments. Some of the environments in this project are very complex. They're very there's a lot going on, and maybe you decide you want to work in the app stream, or let me turn my camera back on. Let's say you decide you want to work in the app stream, or maybe the computer you're working on at home is a little slow and having a hard time with all of those objects in the scene, right? Well, we can create a version of the environment that is much simpler for you to reference, right? And you can swap out those two references and just bring in the higher res reference when you're ready to render. Right? So there's a lot of benefits to using this method, and most studios that I know use a version of this. And what this allows everything to happen is you've broken the linear dependency of the pipeline. Right? I no longer have to wait for the environment to be completely finished before I start animating. I no longer have to wait for the model texturing to be done before I start rigging the character. Right? So this is a very beneficial way of working, and it's definitely something that you will need to take into consideration as you're working on this project. So thanks for bearing with me on this. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll talk to you soon.